October 28th, 2025. I was analyzing quarterly reports from Mexican mining companies when I noticed something that made me stop everything else I was doing. Fresnillo plc, Mexico's largest silver producer, had quietly reduced 2026 production guidance by 23%. Peñasquito Mine suspended operations indefinitely due to permit disputes. And, most telling of all, Chinese state-owned enterprises had signed exclusive supply agreements with 3 major Mexican silver producers. Agreements that completely bypass COMEX and the London bullion market. Mexico produces 25% of global silver output. China consumes 14%, but has been accumulating far beyond domestic industrial needs. What I discovered in the following weeks of investigation revealed a systematic campaign to corner the global silver market while simultaneously destroying Western access to the world's largest silver reserves. This wasn't random policy or coincidental market forces. This was economic warfare executed through regulatory capture, security disruption, and strategic resource acquisition that will culminate in the greatest silver supply shock in modern history. By 2026, Mexico's silver production could fall by 40 to 60%, while China controls the majority of remaining output through contracts signed in yuan rather than dollars. The Western world is about to discover that depending on foreign countries for critical materials has consequences when those countries choose sides in the emerging global monetary war. What this really means. The resource weapon. Deployed Mexico's silver mining crisis represents more than regulatory incompetence or criminal violence. It represents the systematic destruction of Western access to critical materials through coordinated pressure that benefits China while devastating traditional supply chains that have supported global silver markets for decades. The regulatory assault. Since 2024, Mexico's leftist government has implemented environmental regulations so restrictive that they make large-scale silver mining virtually impossible. New permit requirements demand environmental impact studies that take 3 to 5 years to complete. Water usage restrictions limit mining operations to levels below economic viability. Indigenous land rights claims have frozen development of 60% of known silver deposits. These regulations don't apply equally to all mining companies. Chinese state-owned enterprises receive expedited permitting through strategic partnership agreements, while Western companies face endless bureaucratic delays and retroactive compliance requirements. The security breakdown. Cartels have systematically targeted silver mines with extortion, kidnapping, and infrastructure attacks that force operations to shut down or pay protection money that makes mining uneconomical. But here's the revealing detail. Chinese-controlled operations suffer significantly fewer security incidents than Western-owned mines. This selective targeting suggests coordination between Mexican government authorities, criminal organizations, and Chinese interests to clear Western competitors from the silver mining sector. The financial strangulation. Mexican tax authorities have imposed retroactive assessments on Western mining companies totaling over $2.8 billion in back taxes, based on revised calculations of mineral values. Companies that contest these assessments face frozen assets and criminal charges against executives. Meanwhile, Chinese companies receive tax incentives and government financing that allow them to acquire distressed Western assets at prices far below replacement value. The strategic significance. Mexico does not just produce 25% of global silver, it produces the highest grade, most economically extractable silver in the world. Mexican deposits average 8 to 12 ounces per ton compared to 3 to 4 ounces globally. Losing Mexican production forces the market to rely on lower grade deposits that require dramatically higher energy costs and environmental disruption. China's systematic acquisition of Mexican silver production represents control over the most efficient, highest quality silver supply on Earth. Historical pattern layer. How resource wars determine global power. History provides clear examples of how control over critical materials has determined the outcome of civilizational conflicts, and China's Mexican silver strategy follows this ancient playbook with modern sophistication. Rome versus Carthage, the Iberian Silver War, 218-146 BC. The Second Punic War was not decided by military battles alone. Rome systematically captured Carthaginian silver mines in Spain, cutting off the funding that allowed Carthage to field armies and hire mercenaries. When Carthaginian currency became worthless due to lack of silver backing, their empire collapsed from within regardless of military capabilities. Rome understood that controlling silver production meant controlling the ability to finance state power. China has learned this lesson perfectly. Spain versus Britain, the American silver monopoly, 1500-1700. Spanish control of American silver mines provided the financial foundation for global empires spanning 3 centuries. But when British privateers and political disruption reduced Spanish silver shipments by 60% during the 1650s, Spanish power collapsed rapidly. Britain didn't defeat Spain through superior military technology. They defeated Spain by cutting off access to the silver that funded Spanish military and administrative operations worldwide, Britain versus Germany, the resource blockade, 1914-1918. World War I was ultimately decided not by battlefield tactics, but by Britain's naval blockade that cut off German access to copper, nitrates, and other critical materials needed for modern warfare. Germany's technical superiority couldn't overcome raw material shortages that made sustained industrial warfare impossible. Superior engineering means nothing when you can't source the materials to build weapons. America versus Japan, the resource embargo, 1940-1941. The U.S. didn't defeat Japanese expansion through direct military confrontation initially. They implemented oil and steel embargoes that forced Japan to choose between abandoning expansion or attacking American forces to secure alternative supply sources. Japan chose war precisely because they understood that modern industrial societies cannot function without access to critical materials regardless of their domestic capabilities. The pattern. In every case, the victor controlled critical material flows while systematically denying those materials to rivals. Military superiority, technological advancement, and financial resources become irrelevant when you cannot access the basic materials that modern civilization requires. China's Mexican silver strategy represents the most sophisticated application of this ancient principle in modern times. Modern data layer. The scope of Mexican silver destruction. The scale of Mexico's silver production crisis becomes clear when you analyze the specific numbers behind mine closures, permit denials, and security incidents, rather than relying on official government statistics that minimize the scope of the crisis. Production decline. Acceleration. Mexican silver output has fallen from 196 million ounces in 2022 to an estimated 145 million ounces in 2025, a 26% decline in 3 years. But this understates the crisis because most mine closures have occurred in the final months of 2025. Industry analysis suggests 2026 production could fall to 95 to 110 million ounces as current regulatory and security pressures force additional mine suspensions. This represents a potential 45 to 50% decline from peak production levels. Mine closure cascade, Peñasquito, Newmont, suspended. October 2025, 12 million ounces annually. San Julian, Fresnillo, reduced operations. 40%, 8 million ounces lost. La Encantada, First Majestic. Environmental permit revoked, 6 million ounces, Real de Angeles, Hecla. Security incidents forced closure, 4 million ounces. Smaller operations, 15 plus mines suspended, combined 25 million ounces. Total confirmed losses, 55 million ounces annually from operations that were functioning normally in 2024. The Chinese acquisition pattern. While Western companies face regulatory assault, Chinese state-owned enterprises have quietly acquired controlling interests in Mexican silver production. Chinalco acquired 40% stake in Fresnillo operations. Through joint venture, China, Min Metals, signed exclusive offtake agreements for 60 million ounces annually. Zijin Mining purchased distressed assets from 3 suspended Western operations. State-owned CITIC Resources established new joint ventures with Mexican government entities, combined Chinese-controlled production. Estimated 85-95 million ounces annually by 2027, representing 60-65% of remaining Mexican output. The COMEX bypass mechanism. Chinese silver purchases from Mexico occur through bilateral trade agreements denominated in yuan rather than dollars. These transactions don't appear in COMEX inventory data or London bullion market statistics. This creates artificial scarcity in Western silver markets, while China accumulates massive physical stockpiles that never enter the pricing mechanisms that determine official silver values. The security targeting data. Analysis of cartel attacks on mining operations reveals systematic patterns that suggest coordination rather than random criminal activity. Western-owned operations. 47 major security incidents in 2025. Chinese-controlled operations. 3 major security incidents in 2025. The probability of this distribution occurring randomly is less than 0.02%, suggesting deliberate targeting that benefits Chinese interests while destroying Western access to Mexican silver. The hidden mechanism, how China corners silver through Mexico. Understanding how China uses Mexico to corner global silver markets requires grasping the sophisticated financial and diplomatic mechanisms that make resource acquisition appear like normal commercial activity rather than strategic warfare. The Belt and Road infrastructure. China's investment in Mexican infrastructure creates dependency relationships that give Beijing leverage over Mexican resource policy. Chinese-financed ports, railways, and refineries provide the logistics infrastructure that makes Mexican silver exports economically viable. But the infrastructure investments include clauses that give China priority access to Mexican resources during supply disruptions, language that becomes critically important when those disruptions are engineered through regulatory and security pressure. The currency strategy. Chinese purchases of Mexican silver occur through peso-yuan swap agreements that bypass dollar markets entirely. This provides Mexico with desperately needed hard currency while allowing China to accumulate silver without affecting COMEX pricing or triggering Western attention. The bilateral currency arrangements also create financial incentives for Mexico to favor Chinese buyers over Western competitors who must pay in dollars that Mexico then converts to yuan to service Chinese infrastructure loans. The technology transfer angle. China offers advanced mining technology and environmental remediation capabilities that allow Mexican operations to meet new regulatory requirements, but only for operations that sign exclusive supply agreements with Chinese state-owned enterprises. This creates a choice for Mexican silver producers: partner with China and gain access to technology that enables continued production, or maintain independence and face regulatory compliance costs that make operations uneconomical. The refining monopoly. China has systematically acquired silver refining capacity in Mexico, while Western companies focus on mining operations. This gives China control over the final processing stages that determine the form and destination of Mexican silver output. Even silver mined by Western companies often gets processed through Chinese-controlled refineries, providing China with detailed intelligence about Western silver consumption patterns, while creating opportunities to divert supply toward Chinese stockpiles. The financial warfare component. Chinese state-owned banks provide financing for Mexican mining operations at below-market rates in exchange for supply commitments that extend 10 to 20 years into the future. Western mining companies cannot compete with state-subsidized financing that treats silver acquisition as strategic investment rather than commercial transaction. The Chinese approach sacrifices short-term profits for long-term resource control. Eruption scenario. The 2026 silver supply shock. Based on current mine closure rates, Chinese acquisition patterns, and regulatory trends, here's how the Mexican silver crisis will create global supply disruption that fundamentally alters silver markets. Q1. 2026. The production cliff. Additional mine closures reduce Mexican output to 100 to 110 million ounces annually, down from 196 million ounces in 2022. Western silver companies face 55+ million ounces of lost annual production, while Chinese-controlled operations increase output. Global silver supply falls by 6 to 8%, while Chinese stockpiling removes an additional 3 to 4% from available inventory. Physical markets begin showing strain as industrial users compete for shrinking supply. Q2, 2026, the COMEX crisis. Reduced Mexican silver flows to Western markets create delivery stress at COMEX as arbitrageurs demand physical silver for Asian export. Exchange inventories fall below critical thresholds, while open interest remains elevated. COMEX implements delivery delays and administrative requirements to prevent inventory depletion, signaling that paper markets can no longer guarantee physical delivery at contract prices. Q3, 2026, the price discovery breakdown. Chinese-controlled Mexican silver trades at 20 to 30 premiums to COMEX prices, as bilateral agreements bypass Western price discovery mechanisms. Physical silver becomes unavailable at official prices, while Chinese stockpiles grow. Industrial users begin panic buying as they recognize that traditional supply chains have been systematically disrupted. Solar panel and electronics manufacturers face production delays due to silver shortages. Q4, 2026, the strategic reserve depletion. Western governments attempt to stabilize markets by releasing strategic silver reserves, but discover that total reserves represent only 2 to 3 weeks of industrial consumption. Emergency releases provide a temporary price relief, but confirm to markets that Western nations lack adequate strategic stockpiles of critical materials they assumed would always be available through international trade. 2027, the new silver order. China announces official strategic silver reserves exceeding 300 million ounces, while simultaneously restricting exports of silver-intensive manufactured goods to ensure domestic supply security. Mexican silver production becomes fully integrated into Chinese resource strategy, while Western nations face permanent supply disruption that forces industrial adjustment to silver scarcity pricing. The warning: the end of resource. Globalization. Mexico's silver crisis represents more than commodity market disruption. It represents the end of the globalization era where Western nations assumed permanent access to foreign resources without considering the strategic implications of dependency. The dependency revelation. For 50 years, Western economies have operated on the assumption that critical materials would remain available through international trade. regardless of geopolitical developments. The Mexican silver crisis proves this assumption was naive. Nations that control critical resources will use those resources as weapons when broader conflicts emerge. Depending on foreign countries for materials essential to modern civilization creates vulnerability that rivals will inevitably exploit. The industrial reckoning. Western technology companies have built business models that assume permanent access to silver, lithium, rare earth elements, and other materials controlled by potentially hostile nations. As resource access becomes weaponized, these companies face impossible choices: accept dramatically higher material costs that destroy profitability, or relocate operations to resource-controlling nations that may seize assets during future conflicts. The strategic response requirements. Western nations need immediate programs to develop domestic silver production, expand strategic reserves, and reduce industrial dependency on silver-intensive technologies, but developing alternative supply sources requires 7 to 15 years, while current supply disruptions are happening immediately. The timeline gap between recognition and response may be too large to prevent severe economic disruption. The individual implications. For ordinary citizens, the Mexican silver crisis provides early warning about the vulnerability of supply chains that support modern living standards. When resource wars intensify, access to technology products, renewable energy systems, and medical devices will become constrained by international political considerations rather than market economics. The investment realities. Traditional commodity investment strategies assumed that supply would always increase to meet rising demand through normal market mechanisms. The Mexican crisis proves that political factors can override economic incentives when resource control becomes strategically important. Physical ownership of critical materials provides protection against supply disruption, while paper claims on commodities may become worthless when political considerations override commercial contracts. The timeline. Urgency. The Mexican silver situation is accelerating faster than most analysis anticipated. What seemed like gradual regulatory pressure in 2024 has become systematic production destruction in 2025. Similar patterns may already be developing in other critical material supply chains controlled by nations that prioritize Chinese strategic interests over Western commercial needs. The new reality. The era of resource globalization, where materials flowed freely based on economic efficiency, has ended permanently. Resource flows will now be determined by strategic alliances, political considerations, and the balance of power between competing civilizational blocs. Western nations that fail to adjust to this new reality will discover that commercial relationships provide no protection when resource-controlling nations choose to favor strategic partners over traditional customers. The Mexican lesson. Mexico's choice to align with Chinese strategic interests over Western commercial relationships demonstrates how quickly resource flows can be redirected when political incentives change. Other resource-producing nations are watching the Mexican example carefully, evaluating whether Chinese strategic partnerships offer better long-term security than Western commercial relationships that provide no protection against political or economic pressure. The Mexican silver shutdown isn't an isolated incident. It is a preview of how resource wars will unfold across multiple critical materials as the global economy fragments into competing strategic blocs. China's quiet pivot through Mexico proves that the country controlling the most critical materials will determine which civilizational bloc thrives and which faces permanent disadvantage in the emerging multipolar world order. For Western nations and their citizens, the choice is becoming clear. Develop domestic alternatives rapidly, or accept permanent dependency on rivals who will use that dependency as leverage in every future conflict. The Mexican silver crisis is just the beginning. The resource wars are accelerating, and China is winning because they understood the strategic importance of critical materials, while Western nations focused on financial engineering and service sector economics. The 2026 supply shock will be the wake-up call that forces Western recognition of their vulnerability. The question is whether that recognition will come soon enough to develop effective responses, or too late to prevent permanent strategic disadvantage in the resource-scarce world that China is systematically creating.